On the morning of the 1st of January 1945, the roar of 32 Merlin engines shattered the silence of the snow-covered Eifel Mountains. For the next hour, 16 Mosquitoes would fly at around 200 feet through unfamiliar mountain valleys, trying to drop 4,000-pound bombs into railway tunnel entrances. Hours later that same morning, hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters were sweeping across Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands and northern France. The same morning, Operation Bodenplatte had been launched, Germany's last great aerial gamble in the West. One of those operations filled books, the other almost vanished. This is the raid history remembered only as background noise to Bodenplatte. Same morning, same January dawn. Two last gambles, and only one of them became famous. 16 days before New Year's Day, on 16th of December 1944, 3 German armies and 25 divisions struck the thinly held American sector of the Ardennes front at 05:30 hours. Hitler called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The objectives were sweeping: break through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Anglo-American alliance before either the Soviet winter offensive or the arithmetic of American industrial production finished the Reich. If a single decisive blow landed at the right seam, the coalition might fracture, and Germany might buy time for a negotiated peace. The strategic logic reached back to 1940. In May of that year, German armour had crashed through the Ardennes because French and British commanders had concluded the forested, hilly terrain was impassable for mechanised forces at scale. The Germans had calculated differently and proved catastrophically right. In December 1944, Hitler was betting that Allied planners had made the same mistake again, that the same ground, having worked once, could be cracked open a second time. The operational security around the German build-up was extraordinary. US Army official historian Hugh M. Cole documented it in detail. Rail movements and road marches confined to darkness only. A total radio blackout across the Eifel concentration zone. Special security detachments assigned to every vehicle park. Senior officers personally sworn to secrecy under threat of the death penalty. The number of deserters was surprisingly small, Cole recorded. Only 5 on the Western Front during the first 12 days of December. Across an entire front over nearly 2 weeks, 5 men. It was the most disciplined secret-keeping of the Western War. Weather supplied the other layer of cover. Dense cloud, fog and snow blanketed the Ardennes throughout November and into December. Allied tactical air forces were largely grounded. German planners had specifically chosen December partly for that protection. When a high-pressure system moved in from the east on 23rd of December and produced what one military analysis described as nearly picture-perfect flying conditions, Allied aircraft were in the air within hours and immediately began contributing to the stall of the German advance. But the bulge was already 50 miles deep in places, and the question had shifted from stopping the breakthrough to strangling what was feeding it. That question brought Allied air planners to the Eifel railway tunnels. The Wehrmacht that had crossed into the Ardennes on 16th of December wasn't quite the machine its reputation suggested. The popular image, fully mechanised, armoured, rolling on gasoline, had always contained a significant gap between myth and operational reality. By the autumn of 1944, roughly 3/4 of German army transport still relied on horses. Not as backup capacity or a secondary system, but as the primary means of moving supplies, artillery and materiel to and from the railheads. Germany had maintained approximately 2.75 million horses in military service across all theatres. US Army records note specifically of German units in the Ardennes assault sector that most of the equipment was horse-drawn. The panzer divisions advanced on diesel and drew the photographs. The horse-drawn supply columns followed behind, invisible to the camera and essential to everything. This made rail the genuine spine of German logistics. German operational doctrine assumed combat divisions would function within approximately 25 miles of a working railhead. By the autumn of 1944, some units had been pushed 90 miles from their nearest one, a chronic deficit the horse-drawn secondary system couldn't fully compensate. Every ton of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration pack had to arrive by rail before it could make the last leg by road or by wagon. The railway lines threading the Eifel's river valleys were the circulatory system of the offensive. The US Army Center of Military History's official account of the Battle of the Bulge identifies 4 main double-track railway lines running into the Eifel as the principal arteries of the German concentration and the offensive itself. Through December and into January, those lines carried whatever the attack still needed. Allied air planners asked whether they could be closed, not the open track sections, which German Reichsbahn repair crews could restore within hours, but the tunnel sections. Where the railway disappeared underground through a portal cut into the hillside of a narrow valley, collapsing that portal with sufficiently heavy explosives closed the route completely. No improvised repair crew reopened a collapsed tunnel entrance overnight. The route stayed closed until heavy engineering resources arrived, possibly days, possibly longer. SHAEF communiques for early January 1945 confirm that Allied light bombers were attacking railway tunnels on main lines leading to the salient. The New Year's morning mission was part of that campaign. Number 8 Group, the Pathfinder Force, had been built from 5 volunteer squadrons in August 1942 and grown to 19 operational squadrons by early 1945. Its commanding officer was Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, an Australian-born aviator and navigator whom the RAF Pathfinders Archive describes as the driving force behind the Mosquitoes' integration into precision pathfinding and special mission roles throughout the group's history. Under Bennett's command, the group's Mosquito crews had struck Gestapo headquarters in occupied Scandinavia with enough precision to spare adjacent civilian buildings, bombed the Berlin broadcasting station timed for the moment Goering was scheduled to address a parade, and, specifically relevant here, developed what the de Havilland Mosquitoes' operational history explicitly records as techniques for destroying railway tunnels by skip bombing delayed fuse bombs into tunnel mouths. This technique wasn't improvised for New Year's morning. It had been developed over the preceding year and practiced against railway infrastructure across the occupied continent. 3 of Number 8 Group's Mosquito squadrons provided aircraft for the mission. 128 Squadron, 571 Squadron and 692 Squadron, all flying Mosquito B Mark 16 variants. The B-16 had an enlarged bomb bay capable of carrying a single 4,000-pound bomb. It carried no defensive guns, none at all. The Mosquito's protection was its twin Rolls-Royce Merlins, its speed, and the 2 men who flew it. These weren't crews that believed in defensive armament. They believed in accuracy and not being where the flak was pointed by the time it fired. The Pathfinder Force's war losses by VE Day would stand at 3,618 aircrew across more than 50,000 bombing sorties. The men briefed on New Year's morning understood the denominator. Briefings came in the early hours of 1st January 1945, in the cold and the dark of an English winter airfield. Picture what that morning looked like. The briefing room lit against the blackout curtains, maps pinned to boards, target photographs laid out, tunnel portals photographed from oblique angles, the valley approaches diagrammed, the elevation contours traced in pencil. The navigators copying route details, the pilots studying the geometry of the target runs. Most of these men had been marking New Year's Eve only hours before. Allied bases across England had celebrated as well as wartime conditions allowed, which wasn't much, but enough to make the pre-dawn call to briefing feel brutal. The mission plan was technically demanding in a way that made a briefing officer's job uncomfortable. Each crew was assigned a specific tunnel in the target quadrant, a roughly diamond-shaped zone bounded by Koblenz, Kaiserslautern, Trier and St. Vith. The approach required threading a narrow river valley at low altitude, aligning on a stone tunnel portal, releasing a 4,000-pound bomb and clearing the terrain before detonation. The valley walls ahead and on both sides during the approach. The flak positions, almost certainly present at every defended rail choke point, at angles that maximize their advantage against anything running straight and low through their kill zone. There's no surviving briefing transcript for this mission, but No. 8 Group's Mosquito crews had been doing this kind of work long enough that the procedural logic would have been familiar. Speed is survival. Accuracy is the job. The valley floor is where the work happens, and also where the flak is sharpest. By just after 06:30, 17 Mosquitoes were preparing to take off into the New Year's dark. One didn't reach the Eifel. A B Mark 16 from 128 Squadron crashed on the outbound leg, going down somewhere in England before it crossed the coast. 16 aircraft continued east. The Eifel isn't gentle terrain. Its valleys cut deep into the upland plateau, limestone and basalt walls rising 200 and 300 feet above the river floors. The rivers themselves running fast and cold through gorges that barely widen enough for a railway line and a road. The Ahr Valley, south of Cologne, threads between Schuld and Addenau through exactly this kind of country. The Artelbahn follows the river closely, ducking in and out of tunnels where the valley narrows too far for open-air track. In January, snow covers the plateau above. The valley floors are grey and frozen. The tunnel portals are stone-framed apertures cut into dark hillsides, and from the air at low altitude they are visible mainly because you are already committed to the approach before you see them clearly. Flying this in a Mosquito at 200 feet was, by any account, close to the operational edge of what the aircraft and its crew could manage. The B Mark 16 cruised at around 300 miles per hour. At 200 feet above a valley floor in mountainous terrain, that speed leaves almost no reaction time for anything unexpected. A change in valley direction, a tree line, a power cable, a gust of wind between the valley walls. The navigator had charts and had studied the target photographs, but photographs from altitude look nothing like terrain from 200 feet. The valley walls arriving on both sides, the river surface close below, the stone portal ahead growing in the windscreen from the size of a postage stamp to the size of a door in a matter of seconds. The bomb release happened at low altitude with a time delay fuse set to allow the aircraft to clear the blast before detonation. Whether this involved a true skipping action along the valley floor or a direct aimed drop at the tunnel mouth, the technical literature on 4,000-pound bombs and fusing is less definitive on this specific variant than the broad operational concept suggests. The core physics problem was identical either way. You released a 4,000-pound bomb close to the ground, pulled hard away from the target with the valley walls close on your wingtips, and the charge detonated behind you while you were still inside the terrain. A tunnel sealing mission built around this technique was functionally a bet that the aircraft could pull clear faster than the blast could follow. The flak positions made the math worse. German rail infrastructure at critical choke points was defended. Not always heavily, but defended. Gun positions on the valley walls or at the tunnel approaches, positioned specifically to engage anything attacking at low level. The geometry that put a Mosquito crew in an optimal position to aim at a tunnel mouth was the same geometry that kept them inside the effective range of those positions for the maximum duration of the approach. A high-altitude bombing run could fly over flak and let the gunners chase. A 200-foot valley run offered no such luxury. Every second of the approach was inside the gunner's ideal engagement envelope. The Mosquitoes' answer to this was speed and a small silhouette. No gun turrets to add drag, no extra crew to add weight. 2 men, 2 Merlins, and the knowledge that a stationary or predictable target lives longer only in the mind of the gunner. Some crews flew the approach with small jinking corrections rather than a perfectly straight run, accepting the cost in aim for the gain in unpredictability. Others trusted that speed and commitment to a straight line gave the gunner the least possible time to track and fire accurately. There was no obviously right answer. There was only the approach, and then the release, and then the pullout. 16 aircraft flew into the Eifel valleys that morning. Number 8 Group's operational accounting, recovered from the mission records accessed through a specialist forum thread citing ORB extracts, records the outcome. 17 dispatched, 1 down in England outbound, 16 reaching the target area. 12 crews, including the one that wouldn't return, were credited with attacking their primary tunnel targets. 4 aircraft struck secondary targets. On Luftwaffe fighter bases to the east, a very different calculation had already been set in motion. The coded New Year's Eve signal had arrived at fighter units across Western Germany. 1945, Zeit 9:20 Uhr. Translated, the operation to commence on 1st of January 1945 at 9:20. The planning designation had been Hermann. The operational name was Bodenplatte, baseplate. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had promised Hitler the Luftwaffe could still deliver a decisive blow against Allied air power in the West. Bodenplatte was that promise being cashed. Somewhere between 800 and 1,000 aircraft, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, Junkers Ju-88 Pathfinders leading the formations, lifted off before dawn on 1st of January, timing their approach to arrive over Allied airfields at first light. 10 Jagdgeschwader were committed. 20 Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands and northern France were targeted. The timing was deliberate. Allied New Year's Eve celebrations had been documented by German intelligence. Allied airfields on New Year's morning might have aircraft on the ground, engines cold, defences slower to respond. For a Luftwaffe that had spent most of 1944 being ground down on every front simultaneously, the calculation was simple. Catch the enemy when he's distracted, strike hard in the first minutes, destroy what you can before the Spitfires and Typhoons are airborne. What those German pilots couldn't know, was that some of the Allied airfields had a great many anti-aircraft guns installed specifically to counter V-1 flying bomb attacks, and that Allied censorship would spend days suppressing the actual scale of the damage, which meant the Luftwaffe's victory claims had nowhere to be corrected by incoming information, and that Luftwaffe flak commanders on the home bases had not been briefed on the operation's departure timing, so German anti-aircraft crews opened fire on German fighters both outbound and on the return, across multiple bases throughout the morning. While those Bodenplatte formations were taxiing and taking off into the New Year's dark, the Mosquitoes were already in the Eifel valleys, running their approaches on tunnel portals that no one outside No. 8 Group knew were being attacked. The first Bodenplatte waves hit Allied airfields around 09:15 in the morning. FW-190s and BF-109s came in at treetop level, each carrying a bomb, and were met by Allied anti-aircraft fire and by Spitfires, Typhoons and Tempests scrambling to intercept them. More waves followed. The German aircraft flew so low that gunners sometimes had to cease fire because targets disappeared behind buildings. Wave followed wave across 20 Allied airfields for the better part of an hour. The Mosquitoes had been airborne since just after 06:30. They were completing their tunnel runs, turning for home, some of them already crossing back over the Allied lines as the Bodenplatte formations were finding their targets. The two operations shared New Year's Day 1945 across different clock faces on the same morning. Neither command knew what was happening in the other's theatre in those hours. The Mosquito crews returning to England didn't see the Luftwaffe formations building over the German fighter bases. The Bodenplatte pilots, racing west at treetop height, didn't know that 16 twin-engine aircraft had already been down in the Eifel valleys for 2 hours, dropping 4,000-pound bombs on the rail tunnels their supply trains had to use. The Allied losses from Bodenplatte were substantial. Somewhere between 250 and 495 Allied aircraft were damaged or destroyed across the targeted airfields. The figures vary by source, and Allied censorship immediately after the attack suppressed the full numbers. Most of the struck airfields were out of action for up to 2 weeks. The German losses were catastrophic in a way that couldn't be repaired. Luftwaffe pilot casualties for 1st of January 1945 reached 143 killed or missing, 70 captured and 21 wounded, the single largest one-day pilot loss in the Luftwaffe's history. 3 Geschwaderkommandoren, wing commanders, were among the dead and captured. Some formations lost more than half their effective strength in the course of a single morning. And scores of those aircraft were destroyed by German flak. Anti-aircraft commanders hadn't been briefed on the operation's timing, and their crews opened fire on their own aircraft, both outbound and inbound, throughout the attack. The secrecy that had kept Bodenplatte alive long enough to launch it ensured that a significant portion of its aircraft died at the hands of their own side on the return leg. Adolf Hitler had opposed the operation from the beginning. His strategic objection was straightforward and, in retrospect, exactly correct. After the war, his assessment was precise. In this forced action, they had sacrificed their last reserves, and the enemy was able to replace material losses quickly. Allied aircraft production could absorb these losses within days. Allied pilot training pipelines were intact and producing replacements at a rate Germany hadn't matched since 1942. Germany had neither the factory capacity nor the time. Bodenplatte temporarily grounded Allied airfields. It permanently ended a significant fraction of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilot corps, men that no production rate could replace by spring 1945. Germany's last great aerial throw in the West burned the hand that threw it. In the Ahr Valley, one of the Mosquitoes didn't come back. The Ahr runs northwest from the Eifel Plateau toward the Rhine, cutting a narrow valley through the basalt uplands of the northern Eifel. The stretch between Schuld and Ardennes, roughly 10 kilometers of terrain that tightens progressively, has the character of a gorge more than a valley. The hillsides rise steeply on both sides. The river bends frequently, and the valley floor in places barely accommodates the track of the Autobahn alongside the water. Snow on the slopes in January, the rock faces grey-black where moisture has stained them, the river running dark between ice-edged banks. Adolf sits roughly in the centre of the northern Eifel. Schuld is a few kilometres to the southeast. Between them, on the valley floor, is Dumpelfeld. Mosquito PF414, a B Mark 16 from 692 Squadron, had taken off at 0651 hours, among the first aircraft airborne that morning. The Aviation Safety Network's loss record for PF414 is spare, as these records tend to be. Took off at 0651 hours for mission to railway tunnels. Hit by flak, flew into Hill SE of Schuld and towards Adolf, Eifel. Both crew members were killed. No additional detail exists in the accessible record. The aircraft was hit. It went into the hillside. A Mosquito running a tunnel approach at low altitude in that valley, on the valley floor heading toward a defended portal, hit by flak and without the altitude to recover. The terrain does the rest within seconds. This entry in the Aviation Safety Network database, drawn from RAF operational records, is the sharpest independent confirmation that the valley approaches were exactly as lethal as the mission profile implied. Low-level flight into defended mountain terrain at 200 feet gives a crew nowhere to go when the shells connect. The abstract danger of the attack profile becomes concrete at Schuld. 2 men took off from an English base at 0651 on New Year's morning and were dead in the Eifel before Bodenplatte's formations had finished forming up over their home bases. The crew names recorded in at least one oral account of the mission, rendered phonetically as a flight lieutenant and a sergeant, haven't been confirmed against CWGC records or RAF loss files. In RAF usage, N for Nan was the standard phonetic designation for an aircraft coded with the letter N, and Nan, in verbal mission accounts, almost certainly refers to the aircraft designation rather than a pilot's surname. The archival path to confirm the crew's identities runs through the National Archives AIR 27 series, the squadron operational record books for the relevant units on 1 January 1945, and that research hasn't been completed in accessible sources. The men who flew PF414 into the Ahr Valley that morning deserve a name attached to the record. That name isn't confirmed here, so the record is stated as it stands. A crew of 2, a B Mark 16 from 692 Squadron, and the Ahr Valley hillside southeast of Schuld. The operational accounting for the mission, drawn from No. 8 group records as cited in a specialist aviation forum thread with access to ORB extracts. 17 Mosquitoes dispatched, 1 lost outbound in England from 128 Squadron, 16 reaching the target area. 12 crews, including PF414s before it was hit, were credited with attacking primary target tunnels in the zone bounded by Koblenz, Kaiserslautern, Trier, St. Vith and Euskirchen. 4 others struck secondary targets. The bombs carried were 4,000-pound HC cookies, the thin-cased blast weapons the Mosquito squadrons had been dropping on targets across the continent. The weapon selection for this specific mission matters because it bears on what the crews could actually accomplish at low level. Exactly how a thin-cased HC bomb was fused for an aimed tunnel-mouth delivery at low altitude is less settled in the technical record than the broad operational concept suggests. The core physics problem remained the same regardless. You released a 4,000-pound bomb close to the ground, pulled hard away from the target, and the charge detonated behind you while you were still inside the terrain. 11 of the returning crews reportedly described bombs detonating at or inside their assigned tunnel entrances. This figure comes from one modern account of the mission and represents aircrew self-reporting in the debrief. What crews said they observed during the seconds after bomb release and pullout, in conditions where a low-altitude exit from a narrow valley doesn't leave much time for sustained observation of what happened behind you. The flash of the detonation, the dust rising from the portal, whether stone fell or didn't, these are the observations of men pulling hard away from a target at 300 miles per hour, with the valley walls still close on both sides. Post-mission photo reconnaissance results, German railway signals records, and United States Strategic Bombing Survey assessments haven't been found that confirm or contradict the 11-hit figure for this specific mission. SHAEF communiques confirm the attacks on railway tunnels occurred. They say nothing about whether specific portals were sealed. No German railway or logistics record examined in available research ties a specific tunnel closure from this mission to a specific supply failure. No divisional after-action report has surfaced in which a German commander notes that his fuel or ammunition ran short because a mosquito bomb blocked a tunnel entrance on New Year's morning. The Battle of the Bulge ended through multiple converging failures across several weeks. Tenacious American resistance, particularly at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne declined a German surrender demand with a single word on 22nd December. A chronic fuel shortage that had been building since before the offensive launched. The restoration of full Allied air superiority from 23rd December onward, and Patton's Third Army arriving from the south on 26 December to relieve the encircled defenders. How much any specific interdiction mission on 1 January 1945 contributed to those failures is a question the surviving archive can't answer. This matters. The temptation when recovering a forgotten operation is to inflate its significance, to make it the hidden key that unlocks something large. The evidence doesn't support that. What it does support is narrower and, in its own way, sufficient. 16 Mosquitoes flew a technically demanding and genuinely dangerous mission against a legitimate strategic target, using a technique No. 8 Group had specifically developed for this purpose. 1 crew was killed doing it. 11 crews came home and reported that the bombs had reached the tunnel entrances. Whether that mattered at the scale of the battle remains a question the record hasn't answered and probably can't. Bodenplatte entered the history books within weeks of occurring. German unit diaries, including the war diary of 3 Grupper, Jagdgeschwader 3, described it as the Luftwaffe's last great victory, citing aircraft destroyed on the ground at figures that exceeded what they'd have downed in normal air-to-air combat over the same period. Post-war memoirs built it into a defining moment of the air war's closing phase. Dedicated monographs followed. Norman Franks's Battle of the Airfields, Operation Bodenplatte, the 1st January 1945. John Manroe and Ron Putz's Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's Last Hope. Chapters in encyclopedias, academic journal coverage in JSTOR, dedicated threads on specialist aviation forums with order of battle discussions running into hundreds of posts and detailed airfield by airfield loss tables. The operation had a name that sounded like history. Bodenplatte, baseplate, a Germanic compound noun with structural weight and the ring of finality. The Mosquito tunnel raid has no dedicated monograph. Standard chronologies of No. 8 Group and Bomber Command operations for January 1945 don't list it under any code name. One aviation history publication, Aviation Classics, Issue 10 on the de Havilland Mosquito, describes the New Year's Day tunnel attack in a brief passage and attaches no operational name to it at all. The mission exists in the public record, mainly through the Aviation Safety Network entry for PF 414, a line in a specialist forum thread quoting group-level orbs, a passing reference in an aviation history magazine, and the SHAFE communiques confirming Allied tunnel attacks during this period. As recently as 2024, a specialist in Bodenplatte's history who encountered a reference to the tunnel mission wrote, "This is the first I've heard of a major RAF involvement during that day." The same morning, thousands of Allied personnel across 3 countries watched Bodenplatte. Nobody watched the mosquitoes in the Eifel valleys. Nobody on the Allied side of the line was there to see it. In at least one recent historical account, the mission is referred to as Operation Boring. British operational code names during the Second World War were allocated from lists of random words, assigned to prevent security leakage, a system introduced specifically so that intercepted communications couldn't reveal anything meaningful about a planned operation from its name alone. The word boring on such a list carried no intended meaning. It was the next available name. But boring also describes the precise physical action of drilling or cutting through solid material. A boring machine bores through rock. A tunneling machine bores through earth. A mission whose entire purpose was to drive 4,000-pound charges through the stone portals of railway tunnels. It's either a perfect deadpan British joke about the target type, or an irony so complete it looks like design. No wartime document resolves which. The name was allocated. The mission flew. What the name did, whatever its origin, was contribute to the raid's disappearance from the record. Operational code names function as handles in historical memory. Bodenplatte sounds like history. It announces itself, commands syllables, carries the weight of a final attempt. Operation Boring sounds like the administrative category for events nobody expected to matter, filed under the letters that document routine, the missions that didn't generate stories because they didn't generate spectacle. Scale compounded everything. Bodenplatte was visible across 3 countries, at low altitude over towns and airfields, dogfights observed by thousands of people on the ground, burning aircraft on 20 runways, smoke visible from miles away. By the time the last wave turned for home, the scale of the damage was physically undeniable and geographically dispersed enough that no censorship apparatus could suppress it entirely. Allied pilots who had scrambled to meet it wrote about it that afternoon. Ground crews documented damage counts before nightfall. Witnesses filed reports. The tunnel raid was invisible. 16 mosquitoes disappeared into mountain valleys before dawn. Bombs detonated in narrow gorges with no Allied observers anywhere near them. One aircraft went down in the Ahr Valley with only German flak crews and the hillside as witnesses. No spectacle on the Allied side of the line, no drama visible to any Allied personnel except the 16 crews flying it. The operation happened and ended, and the morning's headlines were already fully occupied by something much louder. Here is the asymmetry at its sharpest. Bodenplatte produced 800 to 1,000 aircraft over populated airfields, at heights where every observer on the ground could see the markings, count the formations, hear the engines, and watch the fires start. The tunnel raid produced 16 aircraft in uninhabited mountain valleys at an altitude lower than the valley walls, invisible from above and invisible to any Allied witness below. One operation announced itself to an audience of thousands. The other was witnessed, in any meaningful sense, only by the men flying it and the German gunners firing at them. One operation filled the dawn sky over 3 countries. The other filled a narrow valley for an hour and then went home. Same morning, same calendar. 2 last gambles. One sent 800 to 1,000 fighters against Allied airfields and became, within hours of landing, one of the most documented single-day air operations of the European war. Studied in books, debated in forums, argued over in terms of whether its devastating German pilot losses made it a strategic catastrophe dressed as a tactical victory. The other sent 16 Mosquitoes into the snow-covered valleys of the Eifel to close the railway tunnels feeding Hitler's Ardennes offensive, and vanished under the noise of Germany's last air offensive, remembered, if at all, under a name that practically guaranteed it wouldn't be. The Mosquitoes flew. 12 crews attacked their primary targets. 1 aircraft went down in the Ahr Valley near Dumpelfeld. 2 men killed. 11 crews came home and reported the bombs reached the tunnel entrances. And then Bodenplatte filled the sky and the histories, and the tunnel raid went into the file folders of No. 8 Group's January 1945 operational records and stayed there, largely undisturbed. No German record confirms a specific tunnel collapse shortened the battle. Whether an earlier and more sustained campaign against those same choke points would have degraded the offensive more sharply is a question the archive leaves open. The tunnel mission on 1st January was one instrument in a larger interdiction campaign, not a silver key hidden from history, but it was real, it was flown, and it happened on the same morning as the operation that took every headline. New Year's Day 1945 isn't Bodenplatte's morning. 2 operations, 2 last throws, the same clock. 1 German, 1 British, both in the air on the first dawn of 1945. Once you know both halves of it, you can't unknow them. If stories the histories misfiled are what you're here for, subscribe.